ahead. Justice, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. It's good to be here.
We really have a big ask of you, right? Trying to make sense for financial advisors and investors of all the noise, giving them real perspective of the environment they're operating in right now, especially considering that we've got local and global so inextricably intertwined. I want to start off on home ground, though, and I'm going to start off with a very bold statement. South Africa's government of national unity is beginning to work, with some pragmatism having emerged amidst all the chaos. And I've got to ask you, are we witnessing a functional political reset here or simply managed coexistence?
Alishia, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's such a fantastic question, and it's such a difficult question. If you think about just where we are, you and I this morning thinking about, where's the government of national unity headed? And you think, the second most important player in this GNU will probably not be party leader by the end of our show here today. So it's all over. But I think what you've had over the past 18 months is a situation where you had a GNU that was, they didn't know who, it was a new relationship. They didn't know how to work with each other. Everyone was trying to assert themselves. It was touch and go. I think there's been a lot of reflection about what it means not to have a GNU, what it means to have a constantly bumpy, this is a red line here, this is a red line here kind of relationship. I would say the kinks in the relationship have been ironed out over time. If you think about it, if there is a problem, if John Steenhuisen or any member of the 10-party GNU feels that, you know what, we're going to have a problem with the budget down the line, they can raise it today, start debating today, instead of what happened with the budget last year, for example, where on the 20th, I think, of February, suddenly there's an emergency cabinet meeting. So everyone is throwing their toys out of the cot, and you don't have a budget. Yeah. That was the kind of relationship. And I think we've evolved in the past 12 months from what we had in February, from what we had in June 2024, to a more stable, more mature relationship. We've learned on the job. It wasn't deliberate that right at the beginning. It was like that. It's got to a good place. Yeah. And the key for the next 18 months will be to keep it going. But as you say, there's a lot happening, and we'll see how it goes. And for me particularly, it will be the local government elections that will put pressure on it.
And look, learning curves are part of any, kind of maturity that comes into play, and developing that. We've seen, as you say, some kind of resilience now in maintaining stability, not without strain and compromise, which has caused, internal friction along the way, but at least no red line ultimatums, as you've put it. So where, Justice, has the real compromise taken hold, and where are the unresolved fault lines that could still have a destabilizing effect?
I think the biggest fault line I see, the compromises that have happened, the ANC did not buy into the idea that it had lost an election, that it had gone from 57% of the vote to 40%. It was a shock, and essentially, as the senior partner in this coalition, I think the ANC believed that, we're the biggest, and so we'll do whatever we want. I think over time, it has come to realize that no, actually, that's not the way a coalition works. You've got to give, you've got to take, and you've got to make compromises along the way. I think on the budget, for example, I think that the medium-term budget policy statement last year was really not just an ANC budget, it was a coalition government budget. If you listen to some of the leaders of the DA, the Deputy Minister of Finance, for example, you can just see that compromises were made instead of the sort of, oh, I'm going to have a VAT hike or some or other innovation or movement without the sort of consultation that was needed. I think the biggest issue to look out for that's going to cause a lot of strain in the GNU will be our conduct of foreign policy. We say as South Africa, we're a non-aligned country, we're guided by human rights and human dignity, a culture of human rights and human dignity. And largely, if you look at the makeup of the GNU, of the cabinet, the ANC has driven foreign policy. Now, if you're with the DA, for example, or with any other of some of the other coalition parties, you'd say, hello, so we don't agree that, for example, a major power can invade a small country. We can't go as South Africa and say, I'm taking over Lesotho today. Oh, I feel like a bit of Eswatini, you know. But when South Africa came in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, South Africa, instead of condemning it, chose to abstain at the United Nations vote, instead of condemning what it clearly should have condemned. And yet, on the other hand, you look at the Middle East and how the ANC has behaved in that, and I say ANC because it's ANC policy rather than GNU policy per se. So there is a disjunction in our foreign policy, and I think it's beginning to cause problems for other coalition partners outside of the ANC. I think that's going to be something that deepens as we go further into the year, simply because it's not going to go away. There are going to be more geopolitical challenges that are going to come to the fore. So you know, to your question earlier, I think for me, those two dates, I'd call them dates really. It's the local government election, which is likely in October, November. It's the US election, midterm elections on November 3, which will determine whether Donald Trump has as much power and no guardrails, quite frankly, as he has had all along. And I think towards the end of the year, you'll see the pressure on the GNU increase, with all these cracks having to be resolved.
So I'm going to let the conversation, flow following that timeline that you've laid out, and I'm going to get to the geopolitics of it all towards the end, right? Before we get there, still on local ground, while investors are watching all of this, they're watching every commission that the country has been seized by. The Commission suggests that we are seeing a bit of a shake-up in the security cluster, but it's real outcomes out of those commissions that's going to speak directly to investor confidence and South Africa's ability to get a handle on corruption, on leaking buckets, on governance, general rule of law.
Yes.
Are we at a turning point?
The history is not good, Alishia. Look, if every South African will tell you about the Zondo Commission. What came off the Zondo Commission? Have we really dug in and done the right things? What came off, you and I, in media will remember the July 2021 riots in KwaZulu-Natal. 350 people died in those riots. 50 billion rands worth of damage was done to the economy. More than 1,000 people injured. If you were in KwaZulu-Natal at that time, and if you are South African watching the images on television, that was quite extraordinary. The president went on television and said this was an attempted insurrection. Now, if he says that, you'd expect that the people behind this insurrection would be known to all of us, would go on trial, and would by now be in prison for whatever part they played in what happened. We haven't seen any of that. President Ramaphosa has done an amazing thing by appointing the Madlanga Commission, and we're seeing all this horrific corruption within the police services come to the fore. Some of the leaders in the police are now being investigated with a view towards prosecuting them. This is positive. This is good. It's a good start to how the Madlanga Commission is working out. The key thing is that in 3 months, when we get the final report, the first thing, which he hasn't done with the interim report, is release it to the public and say, this is what the judge and the 2 commissioners have said. That will bring a lot of confidence to people that, okay, he's handling it. But at the moment, the Minister of Police disbanded an effective working entity that was actually catching the bad guys without reason. And if he remains Minister of Police, he's currently suspended, he's not fired, that's Minister Mkhunu. If that doesn't happen, then the kind of confidence that investors are looking for will be drained out of the system. So it will be, this is a big step for President Ramaphosa to be aware of and to take. He still is giving former minister, suspended Minister Mkhunu, a chance. I'm not sure why, given what we've heard already. But him giving him that chance, he must know that the pressure on him to act in 3 months when the commission finishes and hands in its report will be immense, is immense already. And he has to do the right thing. Otherwise, it will be, well, it's the same old, same old.
Yeah, and I will admit that I asked that previous question with a little bit of cynicism, and that cynicism justified to an extent, warranted as well, I think, because what it does is beg the question, Justice, whether the GNU has genuinely strengthened, trust in government, or if South Africans and investors have simply recalibrated their expectations lower, and whether much of the credibility actually sits not in the political arrangement, but in institutions like our judiciary, like the SARB, like SARS.
Yes, and those institutions, you have to give it to President Ramaphosa. Since 2018, when February 2018, when he took over, SARS was a mess. Yeah. That institution is back and working. You have a fantastic a commissioner. Hopefully the new commissioner will be just as good, but that has been turned around. The NPA, I would say a lot of the rotten apples were taken out. It hasn't done as well as all that, but I think there was a turnaround. The judiciary, even with all some of the allegations, very little by my reckoning, the judiciary works in this country. So in large measure, the institutions continue to work. What has been interesting for me is that if you say, what are the successes, what are the things that work, you're beginning to see, if you talk about reforms, if you're an employer and you want to bring in an actuary or someone highly skilled from elsewhere in the world, there was a time when you had to wait years and years. The system wasn't working. Now the rare skills visa seems to be working. Home Affairs seems to be turning around. It seems to be turning into a real center of excellence with the help, of course, of the private sector and so forth. So some of those things, you've got to give it to this administration. They are beginning to work, and that's a positive.
And that's what gets assessed, when it comes to whether we are at the beginning of a durable political stabilization. But having said that, yes, and I'm following your timeline now, we are heading into a stress test of sorts. This year's municipal elections coming up. Yeah. How do you see the national shifts that we've seen in political dynamics come into play, starting to play out at local level, and what are you anticipating?
I think there are some obvious ones which political players across the board, observers have picked up on, and I think investors are very aware of those. And the first one is that the ANC's loss in 2024 wasn't a fluke. It was deep dissatisfaction with the trajectory that we've been on for 30 years. It was the unemployment number, the growth number, all these numbers are starkly are clear for everyone to see. You cannot have 32% unemployment. You cannot be growing for less than 1% for 10 years. You're just not getting there. And so that 57% to 40%, I think, will continue. I think the ANC is in trouble in the local councils that it still holds. If you look at the trend in by-elections, whether it's in KwaZulu-Natal, elsewhere in the country, in the Western Cape, the ANC almost always is relegated to third or fourth tier party. It's no longer master and commander. So I think that trend will continue. It will be particularly stark for the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, where even with the problems and the internal actions within the MK party, that party has essentially replaced the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal with the charisma, the personality of Jacob Zuma, despite what people like me might write in the papers and say, oh, this and so forth. Jacob Zuma is a very powerful proposition in KwaZulu-Natal. And so I think the ANC is going to take a big, big hit in KwaZulu-Natal. And there are questions we then have to ask about governance in that province over the next few years and how that will work out and what the MK party's posture will be given the many changes in leadership, for example, we've seen going on there. For the rest of the country, I think we've entered a period of transition in South Africa where we will continue to have the ANC on the way out, but not quite out. The DA and others pushing in places like KwaZulu-Natal, the MK party coming in. So it will continue to be a learning curve where we'll have what we've learned in 18 months of coalitions at national level and some coalitions at local level since 2016. We're going to have to continue to learn how to co-govern. It no longer is justice is in charge.
And that's exactly why, Justice, Phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela, for example, has shifted focus to execution at that municipal level in particular, right? Yes. Where municipal dysfunction remains a considerable direct investment risk, right? You've got, if municipalities failing at infrastructure, service delivery, governance you mentioned, billing, water, can't get a handle on debt, this all has severe consequences. So the question is, if municipalities fail, does national reform stall full stop, limiting growth expectations?
We're going to need, if you go back to the 2000s, to the 2010s, for example, there were failing municipalities in Limpopo. The Minister of Finance at the time, Pravin Gordhan, intervened, and there's direct legislation you can use to intervene. We haven't used those kinds of tools to intervene in places where there's collapse. In the Northwest, for example, there's municipalities that used to be shining stars, that, Madibeng municipality and others, which then fell into disrepair, and we should have intervened. If you think about a company like the dairy company that shut down in Sidibeng municipality and moved to KZN because they said, well, there's never any electricity, there's never any water, and so forth. Government should have said, we cannot have a company that employs more than 1,000 people in this province, in this municipality, moving out because of collapse. We should intervene in some way. And so it didn't happen. So what this means, hopefully, is that there is more, in places like the Northwest, for example, there is more accountability. It's no longer that one party wins and then does whatever it likes for 5 years and there's no intervention. So in a way, saying we are in coalition country seems like, oh, it's a mess, there's too many people in charge. But actually, maybe that's what we've needed all along, so that it's not I'm in charge and Alishia's word means nothing. So to a large extent, I think competition is good. It's hard work. If you take Tshwane municipality, for example, and say the mayor, who's an Action SA mayor, she does a good job. She's out there every day trying to fix water, electricity, all these things, and she's got a very high profile doing all these things. But she also knows that if she doesn't do that, in October, November, when we do vote, there will be a change of government and she might not be there and someone else might have to do it. And so, there are positives, and I think in the long term, these are real positives. In the meantime, there'll be ups and downs. Yeah. I think that what I'd like to say is between now and October, November, we're going to see a lot of heat, a lot of words thrown about, a lot of promises made as usual. And we might see, and I think for many people this is not what you get in Western societies and so forth. But many ordinary voters, whether they're in Delft or in some other municipality, will say, this is the time when politicians will listen to me because I'm about to give them my vote or take it away. And so you're going to see marches on mayors, marches on political parties. You're going to see real contestation, and it might seem as if, it looks a bit unstable. But actually, in South Africa, almost always before a local election, you'll see lots of political contestation, lots of instability, if you will. And then on election day, it all comes down and people go back to doing what they need to do.
So I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to interrupt you there, which of these are structurally important for markets and which are just political theatre?
I think the key thing is to say, this year, look out, don't be fooled by the noise, because the marches and all that are good for culture, are good for the culture of competition between our political players and who wins and who doesn't win and so forth. But look at whether actually these municipalities are being supported to rebuild water infrastructure, to have the right kinds of civil servants to rebuild the electricity infrastructure and so forth and so forth. Those will be the key things to look out for. If you have parties that do not talk enough about these things, then we have a problem. But if you see some of the changes in, for example, you mentioned Operation Vulindlela, and you see those actually continuing beyond President Ramaphosa and his team, and this is something we need to talk about longevity of these programs, which I think, interestingly, the DA, for example, as the second major partner in the coalition, and parties like Rise Mzansi and others, actually embrace and see as part of their own program. I think that's a positive. If that continues, whatever happens, say, in 2 years at the ANC conference, and whoever wins, then you have a strong narrative for the future.
I want to pick up on that, because one wonders, Justice, how much does it matter that the power dynamics, seem to be shifting, even if policy, as you mentioned earlier, is, or despite with the fact that policy, as you mentioned earlier, is very much still ANC driven. I mean, surely until we see GNU policy, take hold, still relevant is a question like, what's the future of the ANC leadership?
Yes, I think it's two things. I think on some issues, I think on infrastructure, for example, on Operation Vulindlela, I think on domestic economic policy, the main players in this coalition are getting closer. So the ANC-DA, in fact, I would say your assertion right at the beginning about the GNU is more correct than I'd give you credit for, because the ANC and DA particularly are working together, particularly on the issues that you want Home Affairs to work, you want water, you want Eskom to be turned around. On those issues, on those identified 6 pillars of the Operation Vulindlela, I think they're agreeing. I think where they don't agree and where the rattle is, where the instability is on foreign policy in particular. I think there are deep divisions about that. And because we are in the target range of the US administration in particular, that's going to be a problem. Because we can't just look domestically and say, oh, that's okay. The impact, whether it's AGOA, whether it's tariffs, whether it's all these things, have an impact on South Africa. And I want to say that pressure, you said we'll talk about geopolitics later, but I think that pressure will continue with what happens in the UK, in Europe, with many allies, if you will, or jurisdictions like Macron of France and others leaving the stage, and perhaps more right-leaning parties, even right-wing parties, coming to power.
I'm going to get into that geopolitical terrain in a question's time. Bear with me here because I want to round this up on policy. So before we get to foreign policy, local policy, and I want to take rose-tinted glasses off at this point. You know, it's the inconsistency, Justice, that's unnerving. And case in point, Eskom now talking, registration of solar, now that we've seen people make the investments that they have. When progress on reform is followed by this abrupt regulatory shift, how does that undermine any credibility that has been built up to this point? Or is this the reality of reform in motion?
Well, I think we could have done things better. The example you make is a particular one. I think the challenge is that you have an ANC that's not always in agreement. Then you have a coalition arrangement that's not always in agreement. And you have a government that's not joined up. One of the things that we're going to have to deal with when Cyril Ramaphosa vacates the chair is that he's built this super presidency. And you say, oh, he's got the head of implementation in his office, Rudy Dix, who is absolutely, we're going to do this reform, let's do quick, let's work, and it's a dynamo in there. And then you have the rest of the civil service, which still does things the way it's always done things, and we're going to pass this law and so forth, and it's slow and it's hard to navigate. And so what do you do with this pro-business supercharging supernova and this slow creaking civil service that you haven't changed? And I think that has been a problem. I think that so that's one level of it, where the president is doing all these things with business and his super civil servants, and then the rest of the machinery doesn't work and is working at a totally different pace. I think the ANC still has elements, if you look at mining policy, for example, where it wants to hold on to what's old, what doesn't work, put down restrictions on things. And I think that's an example of what we're seeing now. I think it's part of change. But like you, I would say, how much time should I be giving you to do these things? So these things should be done faster, should be done quicker. What would be interesting for me is to see, however things pan out, whether there'll be, for example, a mayor who comes in and says, these are the things you can achieve very quickly in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And so starts doing those things, because President Ramaphosa got this office that is in charge of Operation Vulindlela in the presidency, and it's supposed to do that, but it keeps on being hamstrung by all these impediments, and so you're not seeing the speed that you should be seeing.
Absolutely, and you remind me of something that Busi Mavuso always says, that 80-20 rule. What's 20% of the actionable things that we can do that will shift 80% of the sentiment down the line, right? But that question I asked you is important, and it's important for investors because it's policy whiplash, it's policy uncertainty that threatens ROI, questioning when investments get made, where they do get made as well. Let's shift now, take that policy positioning into the geo arena here. You mentioned foreign policy is a big one. That's a fracture line that we have got to look out for. How exposed is South Africa politically and economically to global shocks in 2026?
I think we're quite exposed. I think we cannot walk away from the fact that South Africa's our economy, our country being at the southern tip of Africa does not immunize us from what's happening. The world is in turmoil. It's in turmoil at so many levels. There are shifts happening. I think for those who follow the Davos processes and speeches and so forth, I think Makani of Canada in his speech about you're either at the table or you're on the menu, he's saying that we need to come together and start thinking about a different kind of setup in the world. I think Donald Trump's words that, he's thinking about hemispheres and spheres of influence. And so his administration's priorities in the American sphere and one of his key officials on Africa saying, Africa, it's not strategically that important, it's sort of peripheral. What it means is that positively or negatively, all these things will have an impact on South Africa. So we have to, as a country, think very seriously about how we conduct ourselves in the world, what kind of friendships and alliances we make, what those will mean, not just in the short term, but in the long term. I think our biggest problem and our biggest issue in South Africa will be consistency. Who are our friends and why are they our friends? What's the national interest of South Africa? Do we want to be just friends on the basis of just human rights and human dignity? Or do we also want investment? Do we want the people that you speak to all the time? And these are the investors that that speak to all of us, who say, why do I bring my money here when you're not doing something about the policy whiplash that you talk about? So on foreign policy, it's going to be, we have to make some tough choices and make some tough moves to be seen to be a country that has made those choices. And some of them, they won't be liked by everyone, but we've got to make them.
Adopt a stance, right? Because we've got to accept the fact that we cannot control global power politics, which then begs the question, and I'm going to ask in your books, what does South Africa stand for strategically? Are we clear about our economic identity and our diplomatic posture?
No, we're not. I think that's been, we've confounded both our friends and our enemies, if you will, because we are holding on to ideologies of the past. We got to be this amazing, fantastic country that we're in through the help of many, many people across the world. We got help from the Soviet Union, which is now gone. It's now Russia and Ukraine and so many others. We got help from, it's minimal help from the Chinese. We got help from the Norwegian countries, the Scandinavian countries, and so forth. So we got a lot of help, and we still hold on to those. No, those are friends and so forth, even when they do wrong. We haven't fashioned a foreign policy that says, these are challenges. This is the national interest of South Africa today. And so with these challenges, this is what we stand for. And people I don't think anyone in the world wants you to be their friend if you're going to flip-flop tomorrow and be someone else's friend. They want to know that you're my friend or you're not my friend, but I know where you stand so that I can negotiate with you on a very clear, open basis. And I think South Africa's foreign policy has, in a way, we've sometimes said, oh, we're friends with the United States, but on the other hand, no, we're not friends with the United States. Or we're friends with Iran. No, we're not friends with Iran. Or, but they can come and, have naval drills on our shores. Or all these things, they send very mixed signals. And South Africa today needs to say, this is what we stand for. Your question is, what does South Africa stand for? Yeah. It doesn't know, or it knows and it doesn't tell us. And part of the problem is that configuration you spoke about right at the beginning.
Yeah.
What does the GNU pour into this? And at the moment, unfortunately, we don't have a GNU foreign policy. We have an ANC foreign policy.
And it speaks to what you highlighted, the fact that we are very exposed to global risk. But I feel like, as you say, this conversation has in fact come full circle now, because one wonders, with that risk in play, if the global environment does deteriorate, Justice, does the GNU hold under pressure, or does this very big domestic or global fault line that presents domestic risk widen, presenting then a high beta risk, as opposed to South Africa presenting itself as a relative safe haven amongst that emerging market category?
South Africa should present itself as a safe haven. It should be working today saying, look at us, come here, you'll have policy certainty, you'll have open markets, you'll have all these things that say we'll grow this economy by 2%, 3%, maybe even 4%. What it's doing is, in some cases, inserting itself into debates, into alliances where it does not need. I'm not sure what South Africa exactly stands to gain by inserting itself into the conversation on Iran, which doesn't have deep alliances, roots in South Africa, and so forth and so forth. So I think that what needs to happen, and between what needs to happen and what will happen, the ANC will continue to weaken. And I think by that measure, our foreign policy will continue to be confused for a while. But at some point, the sense has to come in. And at some point, that sense will be, what exactly do you want? It will come from pressure from countries like the United States. It will come from pressure from other points. But in 2 years, I think that we will begin to have a real conversation about South Africa's foreign policy stance, about what the national interest really means for South Africa. And when that's defined, that will then open up the doors for people to say, okay, South Africa is a safe haven, or South Africa will continue to be blasted by the many, many forces that are arranged against it or for it.
So just as we wrap this conversation up in the final 5 minutes now, Justice, if advisors had to track just 3 political indicators this year that genuinely signal momentum, what should they be? And conversely, what's dominating headlines right now that investors should largely ignore?
I think it will be key. you know, it's February now as we begin the month and we've begun the year. How the Minister of Finance presents the budget and how it's structured. For many people watching, listening in today, you know that when Lesetja Kganyago stands up and presents his, whether it's his quarterly speech and so forth, you know the strength of the institution that stands behind him, that he's built and his predecessors have built. The Minister of Finance is shepherding Treasury, and it's changed a lot in the years since he became minister. I think what happened last year has put us on a good footing from the battles in February to what we had in the medium-term budget policy statement. And if you see that continuation of the kind of stance, whether our fiscal stance, many of the issues that were all over the place in February had come together. If you see a continuation of that this month, then I think that you can begin to say we actually have a corner of government that's beginning to coalesce and to cohere, and you'll have the finances of the country slowly but moving towards a better footing than we've had in a long while. In fact, than we've had since 2009, I would say. So I would track the Minister of Finance and say what's happening here. I think Operation Vulindlela, what's happening, I think we overload shedding, but load reduction is a major issue. And you've spoken about the key things on local government elections. I think this is our Achilles heel now, that whether it's today in the city of Tshwane, city of Johannesburg and so forth, you constantly have water reduction, load reduction and so forth. These are real problems. And I think those are something to keep an eye on, the real issues. Just ignore most of the noise around electioneering. It's to be expected, and it will be, this year will be a very heated year in terms of noise. You know, every politician will grab a mic and tell you things and shout and make outlandish statements. That's electioneering. We have an election, it always happens. Discount that. I would say watch the United States midterm elections, and that will have a big impact on the ability of the US president to have an impact on South Africa. So what happens with whether he can be held back by the Senate, by the House of Representatives and so forth, those will be big.
Justice, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives with us today. One thing is for sure, markets are now entering 2026 in a complex, or facing a complex mix of uncertainty, right? And navigating it all is going to require a little bit of optimism, but a whole lot of pragmatism as well. So on that note, let's leave the conversation there. Thanks so much once again for your time, of course.